Hey, what's up? This is Jake. You're in Jake's shop. So I'm going to go ahead and do another video on this Camaro. Basically, the hardest part of this whole car was these rear fender wells. I've got this side done, so I'll kind of flip it around and show you a little bit what I did here briefly. But I'm going to go through the whole process of how I did this. You know, this inner fender well, call it the outer inner fender well, was rusted through. Went ahead and did a patch panel on that. Had to get that in before I could even mess with this. So I'll go through the process on the other side complete. We'll go to the other side. I'll take a look at how I'm going to start it. And really, you know, the trick in doing this stuff, it turned out really nice, actually. You know, you can't really tell. It's slightly low right there, but it's almost, you can't see it in the camera, but this is like, you can't even tell. Right where I've welded, there's just a little bit of a low spot. You know, I probably could have heat shrunk that back, but I want a little bit for the filler to flow through here. You know, I'm gonna coat this in Duraglass, and you won't see it, excuse me, at all. So anyways, I'll finish this up, but we'll go ahead and start the process on the other side, maybe fit this into 1 or 2 clips and go from there. Okay, so this is the other side of the car. This side is actually slightly worse than the other side was. Very similar situation though I've got going on here. The first thing I did is I did use a plasma. I borrowed one real quick from work. Plasmas are expensive, so I know everyone doesn't have one, but I quickly cut out a big section of the outer, you know, the main fender, and then the inner one was just rotting away. You know, you can kind of see it in the camera here. It's really just toast. It's really just the outer lip though, a couple inches back from the edge, and you got solid metal. So I'm not going to bother going all the way back and drilling out all these pinch welds. I could, but I don't really need to. When I do this repair, you're never going to be able to tell that it was repaired from the inside of the car, because I'm going to put a flange in it up here like I did the other side, and then hide it. And then when you seal that inside edge after you've welded it fully in there, no one will ever be able to tell it's there. You know, if this was some sort of crazy special car that you wanted to look, you know, everything 100% solid, you could go ahead and drill out all these spot welds and take this whole inner fender well out. But the first thing I have to do is get to this. To get to this, I want to get the rest of this out. You know, really just take a rough mark. You know, usually you try to cut metal out and use it as a template. In this case, I can't. Most of this wasn't even here. So I'm just going to mark on the car roughly where I want to take this out. You know, this panel's actually rusted back into here. So I'm going to take this thing back into here somewhere. Up here is nice and solid. This is really thick steel. You know, anytime you're cutting this stuff, you know, you're just trying to keep it from warping. I use the plasma really quickly, but if you use a cutoff wheel, you're usually pretty good. Just use a really thin one and keep it moving. You know, a lot of times I'll just scribe it with the cutoff wheel, and that's what I'd recommend probably cutting this with if you don't have a plasma. And you could buzz it off quick with the plasma, but if you have not a very high heat plasma, you have the possibility of warping it. But you know, just a cutoff wheel on my die grinder, you know, and once I mark these edges straight, I'll just take my time. And I probably won't bother showing all of it, but I'll just scribe it lightly first and then come back and finish the cut. That way I'm not just digging it through and heating and potentially warping that metal more. That's the trick with all of it. Back into here, it's actually coming back into this vent area too. So I'm going to be cutting this one probably back into here somewhere. And I'll probably take it up to about here. The reason I want to go a little bit higher is because this fender well comes up. So I'm going to finish marking that and cutting it out. You know, another kind of a trick to keep lines straight or see things easier is to take tape and run a piece of masking tape across it, and a masking tape like where you want your cut. This fender well stops at the rocker, which is nice and solid on this car. After I get all this cut out, I'll show a little bit more of that. But I do want to show you a little bit more about this. So this is the inner fender well that I bought, brand new. I want to say it's like 45 bucks. This is the outer portion of the fender well, because there's an inner portion as well, and you can see where the seam is roughly on these fender wells, where you could drill out and cut and just take a lot of time because you've got rear supports welded on here for your trunk panel and stuff like that. I don't want to go through, I don't think there's any reason to do that on this particular application, but I'm going to need to use this lower section of the fender, and then it's going to come back into here, and I'm going to use this upper lip area. So I'll be cutting this lip out because you can see the profile on that lip, right? It comes down, which is that section I kind of have that's rusted, but this whole inner section's gone on this one. I want that, you know. It's part of the fender, so it actually, you know, part of your outer fender actually lies on top of that piece. So the problem is just stamped piece of sheet metal. You can see that the angle on that inner lip of that fender is going like this. Well, when it goes in the car, and if you look at the wheel wells on any other car of this era, the fender lips are supposed to be pretty much parallel, like that. So again, this is just a stamp, you know, it's gonna have to be tweaked and molded. And I'll show you what I did on the other side to make it work. You know, there's a factory pinch weld on the inside of your fender well that comes along here where this outer fender comes in and flanges back. So I'll go ahead and get this cut out. I'll show you a little bit closer views of what's going on in these areas. I'm really just going to be using my cutoff wheel for the most part after I got it all masked and taped off where I want the cut to be initially at least. And then we'll take it on the next step. Okay, so I thought I'd go ahead and show the next step here in the process. You can see I use the tape as kind of described as a line so that I could cut it with my grinder or my cutoff wheel. So I've got a good chunk of it in now. I'm kind of piecing it out because I'm not 100% sure where I want the cuts. I mean, obviously the top is pretty close, but on the back side, I think I'm going to go a little further just to kind of replace where this bumper point is and whatnot. I'm probably going to come in here and then come around the back side. The fender replacement that I have is a patch panel. It's not an entire fender. You can get the whole fender assembly, which includes the trunk pan where the seal is for the trunk pan, you know, where the factory spot welds are along the edge and where this seam is. It comes down around here, and there's obviously another seam right here. I got a patch panel, so it doesn't include all of that. It's really just the face area of the fender. You know, they're a lot different. That's like 65, 75 bucks. The whole fender with all of these seams, it comes up and it comes across this A-pillar in here and comes around. It's got your door jamb and everything in it. That one's like 350, 400 bucks. So most of that, all that is really good on this car, and you know, again, I'm trying to use as much of the stock sheet metal as possible, so I went ahead with the patch panel, so I'm going to kind of stick with that and go from there. But the other side didn't have this problem. This is part of the box pan that's under the trunk, and you can see that there's actually holes in it. So right around in here, this is actually really solid. It's mostly just surface rust. There's actually not, it's not actually able to, it's not loose, it's not completely gone through. So this entire section is going to get replaced. They probably do make patch panels for these, but I'm not certain. And since it's fairly flat and you're not going to see it, I'm not going to bother with trying to recreate these perfectly. The most important part of this is this lower flange right here, and then where it flanges up here, because the outer fender welds, it's pinch welds to the flange back here on this piece, and the lower part of this outer fender pinch welds to the bottom of this flange. So when I cut this piece out, I'll just mark it with a pen, and then I'm going to use it as a template, and I'm just going to make one out of sheet metal, and then just use it and scribe it and fit it. And I'm going to use this as a reference when I go to put the other one back in. That way these seams or flanges that are on this piece of metal are in the same exact spot as before, so that when the fender goes on and it laps over the bottom, I can do my pinch welds in the same exact spot. Same with the pinch welds on the back side of this fender when it goes in. So that's a little bit about the next steps in this process. This side of the fender, I'll probably go a little lower. Obviously going to be replacing this portion of it through here. But this coming down, you know, this rocker is beautiful. It's completely solid. There's no rust in it. It's great. But there's a factory body line right here that is going to be retained. So I'll cut this out all the way to the factory body line, because the seam on the lower portion of the patch panel on the fender does have that exactly the way it needs to be. And the trick is welding this flange back in here. I'll be drilling holes in the bottom of that flange on that lower fender, and then coming inside the door panel after this is all cleaned out, of course, and I'll be spot welding it on the inside by basically just drilling holes or punching holes in the bottom of the flange. You can see this is the replacement piece, and you see that lower flange right there. So that'll get punched and then spot welded so the factory body line is still there, because that's where that lower section is. So we'll be using this complete section of this fender up to about here, and then coming across the top. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get this cut out as a template. I'll kind of show you what I'm going to do to fit that in, and we'll go on to the next step. Okay, so I got a little more of that cut out, and you can see that lower section. I went ahead and cut the inner portion of this fender out of my way, and you can see the flange right there. Now that flange is on that box pan, and you can see that chunk that I cut out of there. So I cut that out, and that's the area I'm going to use and recreate and just use it as a template. So I'm just using 18 gauge because that is about the closest what I can tell is stock on this thing, or what it was before. So here's the piece I cut out, right? And you can see underneath it, hopefully you can see that in the camera, but see that flange? That flange, so this portion of metal that's still stuck to this is the outside of that fender well, where the outside of the fender comes around, and this is the inner fender where it's welded to it. You can see the flange there, right there. So what I've done is pretty just simple. I'm just going to start off real rough. So what I did is I just laid it on this piece of sheet metal and got a general idea of the shape of it. This thing's bent and, you know, it's all over the place, right? So I just need to get it close for now to start. And a couple things, obviously this is going to be a flange down, so this is going to come out, so I want this extra metal here. And this flange kind of kicks down at an angle like this, so I need a little extra metal here. Now, I went ahead and marked it, but I went ahead and left an extra ½ inch or so above it of metal, because I'm going to do a lap weld on this thing. Not trying to be like super fancy with this. It'll be 10 times better than it was, and it'll last forever. You know, if this is going to be in some SEMA show or something and you're going to have mirrors under the car, you'd probably want to find a patch panel for this, but this will be just as good as any patch panel, just won't look the same. If you're underneath the car, or maybe pull the fuel tank out to see it. I don't even know how you'd see it unless you really were looking under the car with a mirror and pull the fuel tank potentially. So anyways, this is what we've got. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this with my die grinder, nothing special. And then I'm basically going to use a box brake, which unfortunately I don't have here, so I'm going to my shop at work actually to, I'm going to just, after I make these cuts, I'm going to go ahead and relief bend this back and then cut this here slightly and then bend that flange down. After that, it's going to be close, but it still won't be perfect, because what I'm going to do is test fit in the car, bring it back, test fit in the car, bring it back. I'm probably going to end up, you know, once I make those major bends, this front bend and that lower flange bend, where these little kicks are and how this thing's kind of bowed this way naturally, with that's how it was in the car. You know, I'm gonna have to kind of push it. I'm gonna push it by hand and use hammers and dollies and just work it until it's roughly the closest shape possible, and then use it as a template when I go to fit this in to make sure it's the exact same height to retain this flange that I need to weld that outer fender to. So I'll go ahead and work on this. I'll get it pretty much how I like it, and I'll show it set up in the car. Okay, so I've been working on this piece a little bit, and here's where we're at right now. Got it cleaned up for the most part, and you know, it's pretty rough. I kind of got it clamped where I like it. I've taken multiple measurements of the distances, because that lower flange is key, and this flange is key. So I want to make sure those are the exact same spots. So I'll probably, the nice thing about it is when you clamp this in, I'm doing a lap weld here, but after I clamp it in, I can actually tap on it with the body hammer a little bit to move it around in exactly where I want it. I can tap it this way, I can tap it up, and I can get that lap weld exactly where those flanges need to be. So I'll finish tapping it, molding it slightly, but after that, I'm just going to take my time and I'll spot weld it. You know, I'll be spotting it here, spotting in areas it's touching nicely. That's kind of more of a butt weld area there. And then I'll be using the body hammer and the dolly to bend those metal pieces flat so they're nice and touching that box pan area, and kind of get that into place. So I'll go ahead and spot weld that up. I'll actually probably go ahead and next step, I'll go ahead and get that fully welded, and then we'll come back and I'll show you. I'm gonna mimic the exact same hole that was in that before. I really don't know what those are for exactly, other than maybe some sort of drain holes and plugs that were in the stock locations. You can kind of see the old one, how it was in there. It had a hole in it. So you know, obviously that's how that was in there before. It's just this rusty piece. So there was a hole here and there's a rubber plug in it. So I kind of want to mimic that same exact thing that's going on in there. Again, it's not factory, it's not going to look stock, but again, you're not going to really see it ever, and it's really just more of a backing plate, so I can mount this outer fender to when I get to that next step in the process. So on to the next one. Okay, so I went ahead and welded that in. You know, it doesn't need to be beautiful. You're never going to see it. It just needs to be solid and sealed. And that's what I was able to do, you know, using the body hammers and the clamps to just get that metal nice and touching, nice and tight. I'm probably going to end this video here with this one. This will be part one of a multiple part series, probably, in doing this whole fender assembly. So, you know, that area is not done. You can see I went ahead and drilled the drain hole that's kind of in that stock area, the box pan. But I'm going to go ahead and start fitting now the inside of the fender well. There'll still be more work in here, and a lot of that work has to do with neutralizing rust, sealing it properly, and painting it. But I'll go over that later on in the other parts of these videos. So the next step, now that I've got these flanges exactly where I want them for the most part, I did go ahead and leave the bottom of that open where you can see where these two flanges meet. And I did that on purpose. I want that open for now so I can move the flanges a little bit when I need to, you know. When I go to fit this fender in, nothing is perfect, and you have to kind of line those up, and I might have to tweak it in or tweak it out a little. Same with this edge. I might have to tweak it in or tweak it out a little just to make sure that pinch weld is perfectly smooth all the way up when I get to that point. So this will be part 1 of this series. Now the box pan's in place. I'll go ahead and do a separate video. We'll do part 2 in a series, and I'll do the wheelhouse component of it. Again, this is all just to replace this area of rust in this fender. Hey, if you like this video at all, hit like and subscribe. Thanks.